The shadow on the tarmac. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise over the private airport as the sleek, jet-black Tesla rolled onto the tarmac. The car moved silently, its electric hum blending into the subtle rustling of palm trees swaying in the breeze. James Marshall stepped out, the glow of the golden hour highlighting his neatly tailored charcoal suit. He adjusted his tie and gazed across the private runway, where his pride and joy, a gleaming Gulfstream G700, sat ready for takeoff. The jet was more than a plane. It was a symbol of his triumph. Born in a small, struggling neighborhood, James had fought his way through countless obstacles, poverty, systemic racism, and skepticism, to build an aviation empire. This plane wasn't just transportation. It was a manifestation of his sweat and sleepless nights, a testament to his resolve. James grabbed his leather briefcase and began his walk toward the jet. Each click of his polished shoes echoed a rhythm of confidence and purpose. He glanced at his watch. There was a tight schedule to maintain. A business meeting in New York to finalize a merger that would elevate his company, Marshall Aerotech, to new heights. But as James approached his jet, he noticed something off. Two ground crew members stood near the aircraft, their hushed voices cutting off abruptly when their eyes met his. They exchanged uneasy glances, their postures stiffening as James drew closer. "Good morning," James greeted politely, his tone neutral but professional. The taller of the two, a middle-aged man with a wiry frame and a name tag reading Tucker, responded with a nod that lacked warmth. "Morning, sir. You the pilot for this aircraft?" James paused, his brow furrowing slightly. It wasn't an unusual question, but something about Tucker's tone felt loaded. James replied, keeping his voice calm, "Yes, I am. I'm also the owner. Is there an issue?" The man's eyes flicked over James, lingering just a beat too long. "Just following protocol, sir. These private jets, you know." The words trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. James felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping in, the kind he had grown accustomed to over the years. He handed over his pilot's license and other credentials, watching Tucker scrutinize them more thoroughly than necessary before handing them back. "All clear?" James asked, his tone laced with patience he didn't truly feel. "Yeah," Tucker replied, but there was hesitation in his voice. He turned to his colleague, muttering something under his breath that James couldn't catch. The other man shrugged, but James caught the wary glance he cast toward him. James tried to shake off the unease as he approached the jet. He did his usual pre-flight inspection, running his hands along the smooth fuselage, checking the tires and wing flaps. Flying was a passion that James had pursued long before he had the means to own a plane. It was one of the few things in life that made him feel truly free. As he finished his inspection and prepared to board, James noticed movement near the terminal. A security officer had appeared, standing at a distance but clearly watching him. The officer spoke into a radio, his gaze locked on James like a hawk sizing up prey. Moments later, a patrol car with flashing lights rolled onto the tarmac. James's stomach tightened. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he'd been in situations like this before, too many times. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. This was just a misunderstanding, he told himself. He'd clear it up and be on his way. The patrol car came to a stop, and two uniformed officers stepped out. One was a stocky man with a closely cropped haircut, his hand resting near his holster. The other was younger, with an air of overeagerness that made James wary. "Sir," the older officer called out as they approached, "step away from the aircraft." James raised an eyebrow, his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We'd received a report of suspicious activity involving this aircraft," the officer replied, his tone curt. "We need to verify your identity and your connection to this plane." James fought the surge of frustration bubbling inside him. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out his ID, pilot's license, and the registration papers for the plane. "Here's everything you need," he said, his voice measured. The younger officer took the documents, flipping through them with an air of skepticism. "You're saying this is your plane?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "That's correct," James replied, keeping his gaze level. "I've owned it for 3 years." The younger officer smirked. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for James to hear. James clenched his jaw, but didn't rise to the bait. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, would only play into their narrative. Instead, he stood silently, watching as the older officer spoke into his radio, calling for a full verification of the plane's registration. The tension in the air was palpable, and James could feel the eyes of the ground crew and terminal staff on him. Whispers began to ripple through the small crowd that had gathered near the terminal. He could see them pointing in his direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and suspicion. This wasn't new. No matter how much he accomplished, no matter how much success he achieved, there were always people who doubted him, who saw him as an outsider. It was an exhausting reality that he had learned to navigate, but it never got easier. As the minutes dragged on, James's patience wore thin. He glanced at his watch again. Time was slipping away, and with it, the opportunity to close one of the most important deals of his career. He turned to the officers, his voice firm but calm. "Officers, I've provided all the necessary documentation. Can you tell me how much longer this is going to take? I have a business meeting to attend." The older officer crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "We're waiting on confirmation. Until then, you're not going anywhere." James took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every rule, dotted every I, and crossed every T, and yet here he was, treated like a criminal for daring to own what he had worked so hard to earn. As he stood there, surrounded by doubt and suspicion, a single thought ran through his mind. This isn't just about me. This is bigger than me. And I'm not going to let them win. The chains of assumption. The tarmac felt colder than usual, despite the warmth of the rising sun. James Marshall stood near his Gulfstream Geese 700, his polished shoes rooted to the ground, a beacon of calm amid the chaos swirling around him. The flashing lights of the patrol car painted the metallic sheen of his jet in alternating hues of red and blue, as though signaling a battle for control. The officers hadn't moved far from James, their posture rigid, radiating suspicion that grated against his resolve. The younger one, in particular, seemed eager to find fault, circling the jet with the air of a predator stalking its prey. His fingers occasionally brushed his holster, a casual but deliberate display that James didn't miss. James's phone vibrated in his jacket pocket, pulling him momentarily out of the tense reality. He retrieved it and saw a message from his business partner, Adrian Keller. "Everything ready. Let's lock this deal down today." James sighed and typed back a terse reply. "Delayed. We'll update shortly." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to the officers, who were now joined by a third figure, a security manager from the airport. A stocky man with a thick mustache and an officious demeanor, the manager approached James, his eyes darting between the officers and the jet. "Mr. Marshall," the man began, his voice straining to sound neutral, "the officers have informed me of some concerns regarding the ownership of this aircraft. Can we step inside and sort this out?" James took a slow, deliberate breath, suppressing the rising frustration. "I've already provided all the documentation required," he said, his voice measured. "What more needs to be sorted?" The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, it's just unusual. Someone arriving alone, flying their own jet, without any crew or assistance. It raises questions." James's gaze hardened. "It raises questions, or it feeds assumptions?" he asked, his words pointed but calm. "I've been flying this jet for 3 years. I hold all the necessary licenses, and every document I've presented is verifiable. Tell me, would these same questions arise if I look different?" The manager flushed, and the younger officer took a step forward, his tone sharp. "We're not here to debate appearances, sir. We're doing our job." James's composure didn't falter. "Then do it. But understand this, I've complied fully. I've shown you every document, given you every reason to trust me, and yet I'm still standing here being questioned. At what point does doing your job cross into harassment?" The older officer, who had remained silent thus far, cleared his throat. "This isn't personal," he said, his tone firm but lacking conviction. "We've seen cases of fraud, planes registered under false names, stolen property being flown out of state. You understand we can't take any chances." James fixed him with an unwavering stare. "What I understand," he said slowly, "is that I've done everything by the book, yet I'm still being treated as a suspect. What I understand is that I'm being delayed because of your assumptions, not because of my actions." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Is there a problem here?" James turned to see a woman approaching. Rebecca Sterling, his lawyer, walked with purpose, her high heels clicking sharply against the tarmac. Dressed in a navy pantsuit and carrying a leather briefcase, she exuded confidence and authority. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the scene, taking in the officers, the security manager, and the lingering crowd near the terminal. The older officer stepped forward, his posture stiff. "And you are?" "Rebecca Sterling," she replied, flashing her credentials. "Mr. Marshall's legal counsel. I'd like to know why my client is being detained without cause." The younger officer scoffed. "Detained? No one's detained him. We're conducting an investigation." Rebecca's expression hardened. "An investigation into what exactly?" "My client has provided all necessary documentation, hasn't he?" The older officer hesitated, then nodded. "He has, but we're verifying." "Verifying what?" Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. "That he's a licensed pilot, that he owns the plane registered in his name, that he's successful enough to afford it, or are you verifying something else entirely?" The officer shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, and the younger one bristled, his defensiveness flaring. "We're doing our due diligence." Rebecca took a step closer, her heels punctuating her movements with authority. "Your due diligence," she said, her tone laced with disdain, "has crossed into unlawful detention. My client has complied fully with your requests, yet you're still holding him here, delaying his departure, and obstructing his business operations. Do you know what that's called? It's called harassment." The tension in the air was almost tangible as Rebecca stared down the officers. The security manager, who had been inching away from the confrontation, spoke up, his voice trembling. "Ms. Sterling, I'm sure we can resolve this amicably." "Amicably?" Rebecca cut in, her gaze snapping to him. This situation never should have escalated to this point. Mr. Marshall is a respected businessman with a spotless record, yet he's being treated like a criminal. Explain to me how that's amicable. The manager fumbled for a response, but before he could muster one, Rebecca turned back to the officers. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to conclude this investigation immediately. You're going to return my client's documents and clear him to depart. And if you don't, I will escalate this to the highest levels of airport administration and local government. Do I make myself clear?" The older officer hesitated, his hand twitching near his belt. He glanced at his younger colleague, then at the security manager, who gave a small, nervous nod. Finally, he exhaled and stepped back. "We'll expedite the verification process," he said begrudgingly, "but we'll need a few more minutes." Rebecca folded her arms. "You have 5. Not a second more." The officers retreated toward their patrol car, muttering into their radios. Rebecca turned to James, her expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked. James gave a tight nod. "I've been better," he admitted. "But thank you for stepping in." Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said firmly. "They're trying to make this about protocol, but we both know what it's really about. I'll make sure they face consequences." James nodded, his resolve hardening. "Good, because this can't keep happening. Not to me, not to anyone." As they spoke, the officers returned, their expressions begrudging. The older one handed James his documents, his tone clipped. "You're clear to go." James took the papers without a word, his gaze steady. He climbed the steps to his jet, Rebecca following behind him. Inside the cockpit, he settled into his seat, his hands resting on the controls. The familiar hum of the engines as they roared to life was a welcome reprieve, a reminder of the freedom he had fought so hard to achieve. As the jet lifted off the runway, James looked out the window, watching the airport shrink beneath him. The confrontation wasn't over. It was simply the beginning of the larger battle. But for now, he focused on the horizon ahead, the endless sky a symbol of the boundless possibilities that awaited him. Turbulence beneath the surface. The Gulfstream Geese 700 climbed steadily through the atmosphere, slicing through layers of morning clouds as the city below faded into obscurity. James sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls, but his mind churned with thoughts that felt heavier than the aircraft itself. Flying had always been his sanctuary, a place where the constraints of the world fell away. But today, even the open skies felt constricting. Behind him, Rebecca settled into one of the plush leather seats in the cabin, opening her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon. She began making calls, her voice sharp and authoritative, as she prepared to escalate the morning's events to every legal and public relations channel available. James could hear snippets of her conversations, phrases like blatant racial profiling and unlawful detainment cutting through the low hum of the engines. The memory of the encounter on the tarmac replayed in James's mind like a bad movie he couldn't turn off. The way the officers had scrutinized him, the smirks, the disbelief. It wasn't new, but it still stung. Success had elevated him to heights he once only dreamed of, but it hadn't shielded him from the biases that clung stubbornly to society like rust on steel. James's phone buzzed in the cup holder beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Another message from Adrian. "Are you in the air yet? Need to discuss contract revisions before the meeting." James typed a quick reply. En route. Call in 20. He didn't mention the delay, the confrontation, or the fact that his heart was still pounding with residual anger. Business came first, always. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, James activated the autopilot and turned his seat toward the cabin. Rebecca looked up from her phone, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Rebecca," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "What's the plan once we land? I can't let this morning's fiasco distract me from the deal." She set her phone down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "The plan is simple," she said, her voice firm. "We handle the merger as planned. But after that, we're going public with what happened. This can't stay buried." James leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "Going public means more scrutiny," he said. "For me, for the company. Are we ready for that?" Rebecca tilted her head, studying him. "James, you've built an empire that's already under constant scrutiny. The only difference now is that we're taking control of the narrative. If we don't, they will." He nodded, knowing she was right. But the weight of her words only added to the pressure simmering inside him. He had spent years carefully curating his image, proving himself to skeptics, breaking through glass ceilings that weren't meant to be shattered. Every step forward had been met with resistance, and every triumph felt like a temporary reprieve before the next battle. Rebecca's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. "It's the media team," she said, rising from her seat. "Let me take this." She stepped into the private meeting area of the jet, leaving James alone with his thoughts. James turned back to the cockpit, gazing out at the endless expanse of blue. Flying was supposed to be his escape. Up here, there were no barriers, no labels, no assumptions, just him and the open sky. But today, even the clouds felt tainted by the weight of reality. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the small, overcrowded apartment he'd shared with his mother and two younger siblings. His mother had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, her hands calloused from years of cleaning houses and waiting tables. But despite the hardships, she had always found time to encourage James' dreams. "Don't let them define you," she had told him one night, her voice weary but resolute. "The world will try to put you in a box. Break out of it." Those words had carried him through countless challenges, through the long nights studying aerodynamics, through the grueling process of earning his pilot's license, through the endless boardroom battles where his ideas were met with skepticism before eventually being celebrated. His mother's voice had been his compass, guiding him through storms both literal and figurative. But even with all he had achieved, there were moments, like this morning, when the weight of those battles felt unbearable. He clenched his fists, staring at the horizon. "I've come too far to let this break me." The intercom buzzed, and Rebecca's voice came through. "James, we need to talk. Can you join me in the meeting room?" He flipped off the autopilot, leaving the cockpit in the capable hands of the plane's advanced systems, and made his way to the back of the jet. Rebecca was seated at the conference table, a tablet in front of her displaying several articles and legal documents. "Media's already sniffing around," she said, gesturing to the screen. There were witnesses at the airport, employees, passengers. Someone's leaked details of what happened. James frowned, sitting across from her. "What's the angle?" Rebecca swiped through the articles. "So far, it's mixed. Some outlets are framing it as a misunderstanding. Others are calling it a clear case of racial bias. The police department hasn't commented yet, but you can bet they're preparing a statement." James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If we go public, it could overshadow the merger. The board might get spooked. Rebecca folded her arms, her expression unwavering. "And if we stay silent, this doesn't just go away, James. People will fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. You've worked too hard to let someone else control the story." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you suggest?" "We release a statement," she said. "Not a full press conference, not yet. Just enough to set the record straight and make it clear that you're not backing down. Then, after the merger, we escalate. Interviews, legal action, the works." James nodded slowly, his resolve solidifying. "Do it. Draft the statement, but keep it focused on the facts. I don't want this turning into a spectacle." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Understood." As the plane began its descent into New York, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The morning's events had shaken him, but they hadn't broken him. He thought of the people who looked up to him, who saw his success as proof that the impossible could be achieved. He thought of his mother's words, echoing in his mind like a mantra, "Don't let them define you." The jet touched down smoothly, and James taxied to the private terminal where a black sedan waited to take him to the meeting. Rebecca gathered her things, her phone already buzzing with calls and messages. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. James adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable but determined. "Always." As they stepped off the plane, James knew this wasn't just another day. It was a turning point, a moment that would define not only his career but also his legacy, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The boardroom battlefield. The sleek black sedan glided smoothly through the bustling streets of Manhattan, its windows tinted enough to offer James a momentary reprieve from the prying eyes of the outside world. The city, alive with its typical energy, seemed a world apart from the chaos of the morning. But James couldn't shake the lingering frustration that had followed him from the airport. Rebecca sat beside him, scrolling through her phone with a look of razor-sharp focus. She had spent the entire flight coordinating with their public relations team, ensuring that every detail of the morning's incident was documented and ready to counter any false narratives. Despite her calm exterior, James could sense her simmering anger. "This meeting is critical," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, But there was an edge to it. We can't afford any distractions. Rebecca didn't look up from her phone. There won't be. I've already briefed the media team. They'll handle any fallout while we focus on closing this deal. James nodded, but his mind was racing. The merger with Horizon Aerodynamics wasn't just another business transaction. It was the culmination of years of strategic planning. Horizon's cutting-edge propulsion technology, combined with Marshall Aerotech's manufacturing capabilities, would position them as global leaders in sustainable aviation. But the deal wasn't without its risks. A single misstep in today's meeting could unravel everything. The car pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Horizon's headquarters. James stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he took in the imposing structure. It was a stark reminder of the stakes at hand. Rebecca followed, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished pavement. Inside, the atmosphere was just as sleek and intimidating as the exterior. A receptionist with a polished smile directed them to the 45th floor, where the boardroom awaited. As the elevator ascended, James felt a familiar mix of nerves and resolve. This wasn't his first high-stakes negotiation, but the weight of everything. The merger, the morning's confrontation, the expectations of those who looked up to him, pressed heavily on his shoulders. When the elevator doors opened, Adrian Keller, Horizon's CEO, was waiting. A tall, silver-haired man with an air of authority, Adrian extended a hand with a warm smile. "James," he said, his voice deep and confident. "Glad you made it. I hope the flight was smooth." James shook his hand firmly. "Smooth enough. Thanks for accommodating the schedule." Adrian's sharp eyes flicked to Rebecca. "Ms. Sterling, always a pleasure." Rebecca nodded politely. "Likewise, Mr. Keller." Adrian gestured toward the conference room. "Shall we? The board's eager to hear your final presentation." James followed him into the room, where a long table dominated the space. Horizon's board members, a mix of seasoned executives and sharp-eyed investors, were seated around it, their expressions a blend of curiosity and skepticism. Sarah Mitchell, James's COO, was already there, her tablet open and her notes meticulously organized. "James," Sarah greeted him with a smile. "We're ready when you are." James nodded, taking his seat at the head of the table. Rebecca sat to his right, her presence a steady anchor in the room. Adrian opened the meeting with a brief introduction, highlighting the potential synergies between their companies. Then, with a nod to James, he handed the floor over. James stood, his movements deliberate and confident. He had rehearsed this presentation countless times, refining every slide, every point, until it was airtight. But as he began to speak, the morning's events lingered in the back of his mind, a shadow he couldn't fully shake. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady, "Marshall Aerotech was founded on a vision of a sustainable future for aviation. Over the past decade, we've transformed that vision into reality, developing some of the most efficient and environmentally friendly aircraft in the industry. But innovation doesn't happen in isolation. It requires partnerships, collaboration, and the shared determination to push boundaries." He clicked to the first slide, which displayed a sleek rendering of a next-generation electric jet. This merger represents more than just a business transaction. It's a commitment to a future where aviation isn't just sustainable, it's transformative. The presentation flowed seamlessly, each slide building on the last. James spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived every word, his passion evident in every gesture. The board members leaned in, their skepticism gradually giving way to interest. But as James reached the final slide, a hand shot up from the other end of the table. It belonged to Douglas Price, a veteran investor known for his bluntness. "Mr. Marshall," Price said, his tone challenging, "your vision is impressive, no doubt. But let's address the elephant in the room. This morning's incident. The media's already buzzing with speculation. How do you plan to ensure this doesn't overshadow the merger?" The room fell silent, all eyes on James. He felt Rebecca stiffen beside him. ready to intervene, but he raised a hand, signaling that he would handle it. "Mr. Price," James said evenly, meeting the man's gaze, "I won't deny that this morning's events were disruptive. But let me be clear, they were an isolated incident, not a reflection of my leadership or my company's operations. I have full confidence in my team's ability to manage the narrative and ensure that it doesn't interfere with the merger." Price leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Confidence is one thing. Execution is another. Can you guarantee this won't escalate further?" James's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "What I can guarantee," he said, "is that Marshall Aerotech has faced challenges before, challenges far greater than this, and we've come out stronger every time. This merger isn't just about overcoming obstacles. It's about redefining the future of aviation. I won't let anything or anyone stand in the way of that." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. Then Sarah chimed in, her voice calm and persuasive. "If I may add, Mr. Price, our PR team is already working proactively to address any concerns. We've navigated crises before, and we have no intention of letting this one derail our progress." Adrian nodded, stepping in to diffuse the tension. "Thank you, James, Sarah. I think we can all agree that the focus should remain on the potential of this partnership. Let's move forward." The meeting continued, but James could feel the lingering tension in the room. He knew that Price's concerns weren't unfounded. The shadow of the morning's incident would follow him, threatening to overshadow the progress he had fought so hard to achieve. But as the meeting concluded and the board members began to file out, James felt a renewed sense of determination. Rebecca approached him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You handled that well," she said, "but you know this isn't the last time someone will bring it up." James nodded, his gaze steely. "Let them. I've spent my whole life proving people wrong. This won't be any different." The spotlight and the storm. The Manhattan skyline stretched out before James as he stood in his hotel suite, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glow of the city at night was mesmerizing, a tapestry of ambition and opportunity, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The boardroom meeting had gone well, better than he could have hoped after the morning's chaos, but the weight of the day still hung heavily on him. Behind him, Rebecca sat at the suite's marble-top desk, typing furiously on her laptop. A stack of papers and 2 ringing phones surrounded her, the room buzzing with the energy of damage control. Sarah was perched on the edge of the sofa, reviewing the finalized merger documents, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "You should sit," Sarah said without looking up. "It's been a long day." James turned from the window, giving her a faint smile. "I will. Just thinking." "You mean overthinking," Rebecca interjected without glancing away from her screen. "And that's my job." James chuckled softly, appreciating her unwavering focus. "What's the latest?" Rebecca leaned back in her chair, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "The media storm is picking up. Several outlets are running the story with varying degrees of accuracy. Some are calling it racial profiling. Others are framing it as a misunderstanding. The police department hasn't issued a statement yet, but they're likely scrambling." James sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "And the public response?" Rebecca picked up her phone and tapped through a few screens before answering. "It's divided. Social media is a mess. Half the comments are supportive, people sharing similar stories of discrimination. The other half, well, you can guess, the usual vitriol about playing the victim, pulling the race card, and questioning how you can afford a private jet." James clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had prepared himself for the scrutiny that came with success, but it never got easier hearing his legitimacy questioned, his achievements dismissed. "What's the strategy?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Rebecca stood, stretching before pacing the room. "We release a controlled statement, acknowledging the incident and condemning racial bias without escalating. Then, once the merger is finalized, we escalate. Interviews, press conferences, and legal action if necessary. The goal is to maintain focus on the deal for now and shift the narrative later." James nodded. "And the merger?" Sarah grinned, holding up her tablet. "All signatures are in. It's official. Marshall Aerotech and Horizon Aerodynamics are now one entity." A wave of relief washed over James, momentarily dulling the tension that had gripped him all day. "That's good news," he said. "Great news." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "It's more than great. This merger makes us the largest player in sustainable aviation. You've pulled off what most people thought was impossible." James let the words sink in. The merger was the culmination of years of hard work, strategic planning, and relentless perseverance. It was a victory, one he should have been celebrating, but the events of the day had dimmed its shine. As the night wore on, Rebecca and Sarah left the suite to give James some space. Alone, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the leather armchair by the window. The city lights twinkled below, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt creeping into his thoughts. His phone buzzed on the side table, the screen lighting up with a call from his mother. He hesitated for a moment before answering, not wanting to burden her with the weight of the day, but knowing he needed her voice. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual. "James, honey," her warm voice replied, instantly soothing him. "I've been watching the news. Are you okay?" James exhaled slowly. "I'm fine. Just a rough day." "I saw what those officers did to you," she said, her voice tinged with anger. "It's not right, James. You've worked so hard, and they still see you as—" "Mom," he interrupted gently, "I know. But I can't let it get to me. I've got too much to focus on." There was a pause on the other end before she spoke again, her tone softer. "I'm proud of you, James. Always have been, always will be. But you can't carry all this alone. Let people help you." James felt a lump in his throat, her words striking a chord deep within him. "Thanks, Mom. I'll be okay. I promise." After they hung up, James sat in silence for a while, the glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the sacrifices she had made to get him where he was. She had always been his anchor, his moral compass, and her belief in him had never wavered, even when the world tried to tear him down. The next morning, James woke early, his mind clearer than it had been the day before. Rebecca and Sarah met him in the hotel's private dining room, where they reviewed the day's agenda over breakfast. The plan was to hold a press conference to announce the merger, a moment that would cement Marshall Aerotech's place at the forefront of the industry. The conference room was packed with reporters, their cameras clicking as James stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze steady as he scanned the room. The weight of the day before still lingered, but he refused to let it overshadow the moment. "Good morning," he began, his voice confident and measured. "Today marks a significant milestone, not just for Marshall Aerotech and Horizon Aerodynamics, but for the future of aviation. This merger is more than a business decision. It's a commitment to innovation, sustainability, and progress." The room buzzed with energy as he spoke, his words resonating with the audience. He outlined the vision for the newly merged company, highlighting the groundbreaking technologies they would bring to market. But as the questions began, it became clear that the shadow of the airport incident hadn't been forgotten. "Mr. Marshall," a reporter called out, her tone pointed, "can you address the allegations of racial profiling at the private airport yesterday? How do you respond to claims that your success was questioned solely because of your race?" The room fell silent, all eyes on James. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I won't deny that yesterday's events were difficult," he said, his voice steady. "But they're not unique to me. They reflect a broader issue, a systemic problem that affects countless people who are judged not by their achievements, but by the color of their skin. It's a reality I've faced my entire life, and it's one I'll continue to confront." He paused, meeting the reporter's gaze directly. "But let me be clear. My success, my company, and my vision are not up for debate. Yesterday was a reminder of the work that still needs to be done, and I intend to be a part of that work. But today is about the future, about what we can achieve together. And I won't let anything detract from that." The room erupted into applause, a wave of support that surprised even James. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged satisfied glances, their faith in him reaffirmed. As the press conference wrapped up, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges he faced were far from over, but he was no stranger to adversity. He had built an empire from the ground up, defying every expectation along the way. And now, with the merger solidified and the world watching, he was more determined than ever to keep soaring. The flight to legacy. The conference room buzzed with energy as James stepped off the podium. The applause still echoed faintly in his ears, and reporters were already typing furiously, eager to break the news of his powerful statement. Rebecca and Sarah stood near the back of the room, watching him with a mixture of pride and relief. As he approached, Sarah handed him a water bottle. "You handled that perfectly," she said, her tone genuine. "No dodging, no excuses, just truth." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "The merger announcement has landed exceptionally well, and your response to the incident is gaining traction in all the right ways. People are rallying behind you, James." James took a long sip of water, his thoughts churning despite the outward calm. He had won the room today, but the work ahead would be even harder. The merger had positioned his company as a global leader in sustainable aviation, but the scrutiny that came with it would be relentless. The incident at the airport wasn't an anomaly. It was a reminder of how far society still had to go. He couldn't ignore it, and he wouldn't. Taking flight. Later that evening, James found himself back at the airport, standing once again in front of his Gulfstream Geese 700. The plane gleamed under the floodlights, a testament to everything he had built. But tonight, it felt different. He wasn't just flying to the next destination. He was preparing for the next chapter. Rebecca joined him on the tarmac, her briefcase in hand. "The police department finally issued a statement," she said, handing him her tablet. "They're calling it a misunderstanding and have promised an internal review." James scanned the statement, his expression unreadable. "It's a start," he said finally, "but it's not enough." Rebecca nodded. "I didn't think it would be. What's the next move?" James looked at her, his resolve clear. "We take this further. I want public accountability, not just from the officers involved, but from the system that allows this to keep happening. And I want to use this platform to push for broader change, not just in aviation but everywhere." Rebecca smiled faintly, the fire in her eyes matching his. "Then that's what we'll do. But be ready, James. Once you take this public, there's no turning back." James stepped onto the plane, his mind already racing with ideas. He envisioned an initiative that would focus on diversity in aviation, a foundation to fund scholarships for underrepresented youth, mentorship programs, and advocacy for systemic reform. If he could turn this moment of prejudice into a catalyst for progress, the fight would be worth it. Confronting the system. The following weeks were a whirlwind. James appeared on major news networks, sharing his story and using the platform to highlight the broader issues of systemic bias. The media coverage was both supportive and polarizing, as expected. While many rallied behind his cause, others sought to undermine him, questioning his motives and accusing him of exploiting the incident for personal gain. Rebecca was relentless in countering the negative narratives. She coordinated interviews, op-eds, and panel discussions that kept the focus on the systemic issues rather than the personal attacks. Meanwhile, James threw himself into launching the LIFT initiative, a program designed to break down barriers in the aviation industry. Within weeks, the foundation had secured millions in funding from allies and corporate sponsors who believed in his vision. The pushback came swiftly. Anonymous threats, online harassment, and even subtle attempts to disrupt his business deals began to surface. But James refused to back down. He had faced worse before, and he had no intention of letting fear dictate his path. The ripple effect. The incident at the airport and James's response sparked a national conversation. Other professionals came forward, sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination in industries ranging from technology to medicine. The momentum grew, and soon the movement extended beyond aviation, demanding accountability across sectors. The LIFT initiative became a beacon for change. James's foundation partnered with universities, flight schools, and major corporations to create pathways for underrepresented individuals to enter the aviation industry. Within a year, the program had funded over 100 scholarships and placed dozens of mentees in internships at top aerospace companies. At the same time, James's company flourished. The merger with Horizon Aerodynamics had positioned Marshall Aerotech as a global leader in sustainable aviation. Their first joint project, a fully electric long-range jet, was met with industry-wide acclaim, further solidifying James's place at the forefront of innovation. But it wasn't just about the success of his business. For James, every milestone was a reminder of why he fought so hard, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The legacy takes flight. 2 years after the merger, James stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., addressing an audience of lawmakers, industry leaders, and activists. He had been invited to testify before Congress on the need for systemic reform in hiring practices, corporate diversity, and law enforcement accountability. "This isn't just about what happened to me," James said, his voice steady and commanding. "This is about the millions of people who face the same biases every day, in every industry, in every corner of this country. We have the power to change that, but it requires action. Real, tangible action." The room erupted into applause, and James felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he had experienced before. His journey had taken him from a small apartment in a struggling neighborhood to the halls of Congress, and he had no intention of slowing down. As he left the building, Rebecca and Sarah flanked him, their expressions a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You keep raising the bar, James," Sarah said with a grin. "What's next?" James paused, gazing up at the clear blue sky. "Next, we keep climbing." Epilogue. The Man and the Jet. Back at the airport where it all began, James stood once again in front of his Gulfstream Geese 700. This time, the tarmac felt different. It wasn't a place of confrontation or doubt. It was a place of triumph. The plane, once a symbol of his success, had become a vessel for something greater, a platform for change. As he climbed into the cockpit, he glanced at the logo on the fuselage, a sleek design representing Marshall Aerotech's commitment to innovation and progress. He smiled, his hands settling on the controls. The engines roared to life, and the plane soared into the sky, a testament to a man who refused to be defined by limits. James Marshall wasn't just flying a plane. He was charting a course for the future, not just for himself, but for everyone who dared to dream beyond the clouds.